Okay, so chapter 5 was about the writing process, and chapter 6 is about completing the process. In other words, you have the writing. Okay, now how do you edit it? How do you evaluate it? We're talking about revisions, we're talking about evaluating, making sure that everything looks as it should, etc. Okay, so there are different ways in which the revision process works based on what you're talking about. Are you talking about an informal message, something that may be a memo to the person who works next door to you, or even in, an oral recording, just something, a quick note? Is it a digital message like an email, or is it a complex message? The revising content will be very, very different depending on which one you're talking about. Informal might require no revision or almost no revision. Digital messages a little more. Complex messages like company-wide policies even more. So we're going to look at, okay, what is the relevance of this message? What is this message doing? When you're talking about content, okay, we want to make sure that it is clear and accurate, that doesn't leave room for misinterpretation. It's relevant. It gives the person the information or asks the questions that are necessary, and that it's complete. It doesn't have gaping holes in it. In organization, you want to make sure, okay, are we building up in the proper order, or are we confusing the reader? Are we putting the appropriate emphasis in the appropriate area? And of course, are we repeating ourselves, and are we grouping issues that should be together and to make sure they are together? Is the tone too formal or too casual or something in between? Those are kind of the two opposite extremes. Some of the things that are important when looking at others, you could revise your own, you could edit your own, or you could edit other people's work. That's a very common strategy in the workplace to have people routinely edit each other's work rather than having each person just be responsible for their own work. You want to have a person write something and then two or three people look it over, and just to make sure that they catch it, especially if it's a very high stakes writing, maybe like a book or something, or a policy that's going to the rest of the company or even to a different company. You want to avoid imposing your own style or agenda and learn what the writer wants to accomplish, again, when it's not you that's doing the writing originally. What are some of the things that you want to ask when you look at somebody else's writing? Again, all this is not that these things are necessarily irrelevant when you're talking about your own writing. They can be relevant when you're talking about your own writing, but they're especially important when you're looking at other people's writings because, again, you're not looking to impose your own agenda. What you're looking is to make sure that the other person's writing is appropriate for whatever audience that there is. What's the purpose of the message? Who's the target audience? What information does the audience need? You don't want to give the audience a tremendous amount more than they need because you don't want to waste their time. Does this document, does it provide the information in a well-organized way, or is it chaotic? Does it build up from information that the reader needs for the later information, like with more basic and then to more advanced, or does it kind of, go from area to area in a way that doesn't make any sense? Does the writing demonstrate the you attitude towards your audience? In other words, the idea that you want to make sure that the reader understands, based on your purpose, whatever your purpose is. Does it are you putting yourself in the position of the reader? If you're writing to a lay audience and you're a professional, do you want to make sure that it's written in a way that a lay audience can understand? If you're writing to a professional audience, do you want to, you want to avoid insulting their intelligence by writing it in a way that a layperson, you would normally write to a layperson? Is the tone appropriate? Again, are you being too formal, not formal enough, too casual, not casual enough, etc.? Can you improve the readability of it by making it sound better, being less wooden, so to speak? Is the writing clear? Is the writing as concise as it could be? Very, very common editing tool to try to cut out words and sentences. When you're thinking or when you're talking, very often you repeat yourself. When you're writing, you may repeat yourself as well the first time, but then as you move along in the editing process, you can cut the repetitions. Does the design support the intended message? All of these things are excellent questions to be asking when you're talking about a writing. Next, we'll turn to readability. Readability includes trying to make sure that things are easy to read, are pleasant to read, are not overly complicated, are not overly difficult to figure out what the writer is talking about. There are differences between documents that are going to be skimmed by people. Skimming means reading very quickly just to kind of get the basic ideas, whereas reading means in much more in depth. When you read a book, you're reading it, whereas when you like a novel, the whole purpose is for entertainment, so you're going to read it. Whereas when you're reading something that's technical or something that's like instructions, you might skim it to try to see if you can get the idea without reading every word. So when you were looking for readability, in other words, when you're looking for how easy something is to read, you have to look at the words, the sentences, and the paragraphs. How are they structured? How easy are they to deal with? When you're talking about documents that are meant to be skimmed, that people are not necessarily going to read every word, you have to look at, okay, does it contain the key ideas? Does it contain the conclusions, and does it contain recommendations for the reader? If it contains those things, it may give the reader, even if they're just skimming, it may give them the points that they need to be able to come away with something positive from the documents. Varying sentence length could be important. Again, it's not necessarily critical, but in order to, you don't want to have every sentence be very long, because if you have every sentence be very long, it's just going to be impossible to read. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be a chore to read something where every sentence has 30, 35 words. On the other hand, if every sentence is short, it's going to sound like a third grader wrote it. Where, you don't want to say, Molly went to the store, Molly bought a candy, Molly went home. That's fine for third graders or second graders. It's not so good for adults. So, varying it up, using kind of a combination of short, medium, and long sentences is a nice idea to kind of keep the reader on his or her toes, but also not bury the reader in, in long and complicated sentences. Paragraphs. Paragraphs, and also another. I personally, when I write, I like short paragraphs because they convey a quick idea. When the reader reads a paragraph, okay, they stop and they digest it. Okay, what does the paragraph say? If the paragraph has 12 sentences that each have 25 words, the reader might not be able to really fully understand what's going on in that paragraph, might not be able to digest the paragraph so easily. It's the end of a paragraph is kind of a signpost. You do it for ease of reading. You do it to it's easy. The reader takes a look at it and says a short paragraph and says subconsciously, okay, this is manageable, rather than looking at a 500-word paragraph and the reader saying, I have to figure this out. It also emphasizes key ideas by keeping each paragraph, maybe the thesis sentence, the first sentence, or the last sentence of each paragraph, putting together the key idea of that paragraph. You can have more key ideas if you have shorter paragraphs. Some of the things that are also important to emphasize, things like words, names, and other items. In other words, things that you want to stick with the reader. Okay, what am I trying to tell you about this process? What am I trying to tell you about this idea? Obviously, you're going to write in sentence forms. You're not going to put individual words just standing alone in the middle of a paragraph or in the middle of a bullet point. But emphasizing those terms by putting them in key positions in the first sentences of paragraphs and the last sentences of paragraphs in the ideas that you're referring to, those are things that are important as well. Also, things like simplifying, highlighting, again, just by emphasizing various ideas, those are all things that help dramatically when you're talking about the. Next, we look at headings. Now, headings are not appropriate for every paragraph, but they can help kind of be signposts. Headings are what you see on top of a section very often. They could be centered, they could be left, there could be headings, there could be subheadings. In other words, you could have a centered title for the entire section of the paper, then you could have individual headings that are left justified for individual components of the paper. Okay, so headings can do a whole bunch of different can accomplish a whole bunch of different goals. It can add to organization by grouping related paragraphs and making sure that each paragraph has its own purpose. It can organize lengthy material by focusing the reader on one bit of information at a time rather than being overwhelming. And of course, it can emphasize key ideas for the same reason. It can keep the reader's attention by being informative. It can be inviting, and by some cases even intriguing. Headings can grab the reader's attention. It can make the text easier to read. It can help the reader find the parts that he or she needs and skip the rest. It can improve readability. It can do all of those things. The connection also. You can use headings and subheadings to help the reader see the relationship between the main ideas and the subordinate ones, so they can understand the message more easily. Headings and subheadings also can visually indicate shifts from one idea to the next. They can connect paragraphs one to the other. Those are all things that are important features that headings and subheadings can accomplish. Okay, then editing for clarity and conciseness. Clarity means making sure that things are clear, obviously, things that don't beat around the bush, and conciseness means that you don't make it much longer than it really needs to be. While you're editing, you can break up long sentences. For example, if you find yourself stuck in a long sentence, in a long sentence, you're probably trying to say two things. You might break it up into two different sentences. You might be trying to express two thoughts that are not similar to each other, or giving the reader too many examples or too many pieces of evidence. You can do all of those things by separating them into individual sentences. You can also clarify these things in your own mind. Also, rewriting hedging sentences. This is something you want to try to avoid. A hedging means when you're not being fully confident, when you're pulling back from a definitive statement. It doesn't mean you can never use the word may or seems or should or whatever it is, but try to be as clear as possible, generally speaking. Of course, generally speaking was also a hedge, but if I were writing this rather than saying it, I would cut the word. I would have probably cut the word, cut the phrase generally speaking, because that's kind of a hedging sentence when I meant to, say it more definitively. Impose parallelism, which means having two different ideas be expressed by separate sentences that reinforce each other. When you have two or more similar ideas to express, make them parallel by using the same grammatical construction. John is strong. John can lift 250 pounds. John can break a piece of wood with a single chop. Using John has kind of builds it up in your mind. You see, writers use that a lot, that sort of thing. Correct dangling modifiers. Dangling modifier means a modifier is something that describes something else. Unlike, the red pen, well, red is a modifier. It modifies the pen. It describes the pen. An adjective or an adverb. What you want to try to do is try to make sure that all modifiers actually modify something rather than you have modifiers that don't actually connect with the subject of the sentence. Sometimes when you're trying to say something, when you're writing the sentence, and you end up with a phrase that you realize when you go back and look at it later on doesn't really connect to the rest of the sentence, that's the sort of thing that can be cut during editing. Rewording long noun sequences. Will one word do the same as many words? For example, for a period of time can usually be said by just saying time, or due to the fact that can usually be stated instead by because, or something to that effect. Replace camouflaged verbs, which means words that sound like nouns but are actually verbs. Words like attainment. It's the goal was attainment of the of the idea. The goal was attainment of the job, or something like that. Now, what you're really trying to say is the goal was to attain the job. Attainment sounds kind of awkward because you're using it as a noun rather than what it should be. You should really kind of change it and make it into a more active sentence, a more active verb. Clarify sentence structure, try to clarify awkward references. You always want to make sure to be as clear as possible. You don't want to say things like as we said before, or above mentioned, or aforementioned, or things like that. It's better to be as clear as possible. It doesn't mean you can never use those kinds of phrases, but it's certainly better to be clear if possible. Delete unnecessary words and phrases. Again, shorten them, eliminate redundancies, rewrite things to the extent possible. A lot of these are really it's kind of ironic that it says eliminate redundancies when a lot of these are kind of redundant for each other, but either way, it's the same idea. Okay, designed to make sure that your readers are able to read it. Consistency, you want balance. Balance means you don't want, for example, to be too maybe emotionally vested in a particular type of, or focusing on one side or the other. If you're arguing for one side, obviously you have to focus on that side of the argument. But if you're trying to present both sides, or you're trying to present the strengths and weaknesses of an argument, you don't want to be you want to try to be balanced. You can have one document, for example, that has a formal, rigid design where the elements are placed all together, whereas another can have, a less formal design, which is perfectly fine as well. Restraint means trying to be relatively simple, not cluttering the message with too many different types of, italics and underlines and exclamation points and, big face bold things. You can use emphasis, but use it sparingly. If you use emphasis too much, you get emphasis inflation, and everything becomes emphasized, which is essentially the same thing as nothing being emphasized. And then, of course, detail. You want to make sure that your message is not distracted by design problems or typos, grammatical errors, things like that. Document design elements, these are things that have nothing to do with the writing itself. This has to do with things of how it appears, how much white space is there, do your margins look normal, do your justification, in other words, is it, do all lines end at the same time? That's a question of whether it's full justification or or left justification. These are all things that are, just in the document itself, in Microsoft Word or whatever you're using. What kind of typeface are you using? What kind of type styles are you using? What kind of font are you using? These are all things you want to consider. Basically, there's not necessarily a right or wrong font to use, but there are less formal, there's more extravagant, there's more formal, there's, maybe your company has a policy that all internal memos have to be in Arial 12 font. Again, that would just be for standardization. This is just an example of what a letter might look like. This would be, for example, you have the date on top, you have the header. In this case, it's a little bit more of a formal header with a logo. You have the addressee over here, and then you have your 3 paragraphs, your sincerely, this is, again, what a general business letter should look approximately like. This obviously is a relatively short one, but, that's perfectly fine. Notice they're short paragraphs. They vary in length of sentences. The first sentence is only a few words long. We have then the last sentence of this paragraph is a nice big sentence, and therefore the writer probably wants the reader to sit back and just understand that sentence, and therefore it's a good idea to break the paragraph. You might not be able to read it depending on your screen size, but the last sentence of that first paragraph says, "The CG1 carries more than a century of Yamaha's heritage in design and production of world-class musical instruments and will give you many years of playing and listening pleasure." That, of course, is the key sentence over here in this entire letter, probably, and that's probably why the reader broke it up after the first paragraph, because you want the reader to, really fully think about that sentence before moving on. Okay, designing for mobile devices, which could be text messaging, it could be email, whatever it is. Think in small chunks. Small chunks is based on the idea that mobile users consume information one screen at a time when you're on a tablet or on a phone, which means that if the sentence is too long, it might not all be on the screen, and the reader's going to have to scroll back and forth. It's still possible, but it's going to be a little bit more complex. Use white spaces generously, which means spacing between paragraphs. If you know the person's going to read it on the phone, you put spacing between paragraphs. That really drives home the idea that this is a new thought. Format simply. The more complex you make it, the harder it's going to be to read on a phone when it's a very, very small screen. And experiment with different layouts in terms of how they work and how mobile friendly they are. Those are all important things to determine. Then we get to proofreading. Proofreading, you want to make sure that your language is appropriate, that you didn't make any mistakes in grammar, you didn't make any mistakes in typographical errors, design errors, where it could be the page, there's something, the spacing isn't working properly. Everything could be fine, but if the spacing looks weird, sometimes you have double spacing between paragraphs, sometimes you have single spacing. It's just going to decrease from the effectiveness of your message. These are things that you want to try to make sure. Make multiple passes. The perceptual trick is the idea of reading it yourself and seeing, okay, will will this be understandable at a first pass, somebody reading it for the first time? And of course, careful proofreading in terms of being vigilant, being focused, taking your time and all that. That's of course extremely important especially when you're talking about a formal business writing. And finally, in terms of distribution, how are you going to distribute this message? What's the cost? Not only in terms of money, but in terms of time. Are you going to distribute it in paper, in physical paper that's nice printing? It's going to cost more. It's also going to cost you more time to print it out and all that. What's convenient? Sending it out by email might be convenient, but is it going to be as effective if it's not on a piece of paper? What's the most time effective? What's the most secure? Is this the sort of thing that needs security? These are all things that you want to consider in determining how to distribute your message.